Hello everyone, Britt here for Scrappy Boy Stamps, and today we're going to do our tutorial for the Jukebox Mini Album Die set. Let's cut all of our pieces. We'll start with the base layer, which we cut one time, followed by the stitched base layer, which we are actually going to cut twice. The first I cut in white and ran it through a wood grain embossing folder from my stash. The second time I cut it in black and then ran the piece through a second time, using this large arched frame piece to create the thin black outline. Creating this extra frame is definitely optional, but when I start to assemble my sample, you'll understand why I thought it was necessary. To complete the base of our project, we're going to die cut the arched frame twice from dollar store foam board, once from plain white cardstock, and then I traced the die and cut 2 acetate panels by hand so that I would have windows for a shaker card. I'll also be using the black arched frame that I removed from that optional piece I created earlier. Now let's cut the details. If we were assembling this design without the shaker, we would have used this faceplate with the venting at the bottom. For this example, I only needed the venting pieces, so I cut those and set them aside. We're going to cut this top trim piece one time. Next, we'll cut the frame for the main speaker 2 times to get 2 different colors, and we'll cut the mesh of the main speaker one time. There are 4 pieces that look like little belt buckles. These are the top layer of the upper and lower side trim. They pair up with each other by size, and each of these have a matching bottom layer. You'll cut all 8 of these dies once. You'll have a U-shaped base layer and top stitch layer, as well as 2 half-circle frames, all of which you will cut once. The largest detail piece is the base for the front panel, which we'll cut once. The remaining 6 pieces make up the 2 primary control panels. Each of these panels is comprised of a base layer, a detailed face layer, and an accent piece. The placement and purpose of all of these pieces will be much more obvious when we are assembling the entire project, but these 2 control panels are basically where you would find things like the track selector and volume buttons. Now that all of our pieces are cut, we're going to use a few inking techniques to really bring everything to life. This stitched base layer, which I have embossed with a wood grain embossing folder from my stash, is going to be the background for the entire interior of my shaker card. I'm going to use very simple inking on this panel because I want to emphasize the texture of the wood grain while not making it too complicated, because I want it to complement all of the shaker bits inside, not compete with them. First, I used a blending brush with Vintage Photo, which is a nice medium warm brown, and with very little finesse, I covered the entire surface of my embossed background. For this tutorial, I tried to leave in a little bit more of the process. I do sometimes cut out the middle of things like this that are very repetitive, but I've gotten some gentle feedback from my mom that sometimes things that seem obvious to me are not obvious to everyone. Let me know in the comments if you like to see the whole process, even if it's just a bunch of ink blending, or if you like it better with a little bit of the fat cut out. As you can see, even using only one color, I was able to let the texture do a lot of the heavy lifting for me on this one. But I knew I wanted just a little bit more depth, so I took a much darker, cooler brown. I believe this is gathered twigs. And this time, using a blending foam, I'll use a light hand and sweep this darker color over the top of this texture. You can see how much contrast that gives, and the darker color on top of that lighter background, it really gives our wood grain a more realistic look. Also, if you are curious, I'm using the Brutus Monroe Stick and Stamp mat. I really love that the blending buddy that goes on top of it can easily be cleaned without getting the sticky part wet. So when I was planning out how I wanted this project to look, I looked up jukeboxes online, and one of the prevalent brands of the 1950s and 60s is called Wurlitzer. They have a really classic look that we all recognize, and I'm pretty positive that this particular die was fashioned after that brand of jukeboxes. Some of the hallmarks of this brand are a wood veneer body, an arched column exterior that protected lighting effects in multicolors, as well as red trim with chrome filigree accents. Now, I absolutely encourage you to pick your favorite colors and go crazy with how you style your jukebox. But I highly encourage you, if you are going for this classic look, to do a Google search and get some images for inspiration. Now, probably my very favorite part of these old style jukeboxes is the archway of rainbow lighting that frames out the entire box. I did want to mention that you do not have to be as precious as I am being with the stick and stamp mat. Getting ink on the surface will absolutely not defeat its sticky properties. I've just been using it in quite a few videos and was attempting to keep it basically looking as new as possible for as long as I could. Now, to get that same look that I saw in all of my reference photos, I definitely went in rainbow order. and tried my best to get a really smooth blend from color to color. And getting that blend was super simple with these sort of new to me Catherine Pooler dye inks. Not only are these super saturated, but like a lot of other high quality dye inks, these tend to smooth out a bit as they dry. And I really found that smoothing effect helped the transition from color to color. If you're looking to invest in a dye ink that really delivers on a lot of its promises, I can highly recommend this one. As I was inking this, I really made a concerted effort to include all of the colors of my rainbow on the left-hand column of my arch, because my plan was to get to the top and then reverse my color order. So when I got all the way back down to the bottom, I would be able to meet back up and blend the bottom fuchsia color back into itself. I really think planning out the inking and some of the things that I did in that way definitely helped my final product look a lot more like my source images. Looking back at this now, it makes me so happy. I just love a rainbow color scheme. I mean, why pick a color when rainbow is available? Although I must say that red color Samba is pretty special. You're probably going to be seeing it on some holiday makes coming up soon. What can I say? I'm a fan of the drama. In preparing for this tutorial, I tried to figure out what the names of some of the parts of a jukebox were. First of all, that information is not easy to find, but I did eventually find a parts manufacturer that had all the names listed. And this part right here is actually called the U plastic because it's shaped like a U and it's plastic. When I read it, it made me laugh because it made me think of the story that I heard about the people who named Manly Beach in Australia. The British colonizers were looking at this beach from their ship, and the native men who were standing on the shore were so burly and manly that they just decided to name that Manly Beach. That is absolutely one of my favorite facts in the world. You should look it up. It's true. And it definitely feels like the same principle of naming things was used here. It's plastic and it's a U. U plastic. Manly men on a beach. Manly Beach. You see what I mean? Are you picking up what I'm putting down? Anyway, back to the card. These U plastic pieces were also often covering up the same multicolored lighting effects. So it was super easy to just mimic what I did on the larger piece. Now that we've added all of our beautiful color, it is time to start assembling. As is the case for most of these large dies, we're going to start by adhering our stitched base layer to our main base layer. Now that that's done, I am going to explain why I chose to include this optional thin frame that I created earlier. I wanted only the body of the jukebox to be wood grain, but at the same time, I wanted a black and white outline for the exterior of my finished piece. And as a bonus, I knew that using this other black arch would really help me get my shaker panel and my back layer to line up perfectly. It was a win-win. Now, if you saw my last video, the pirate porthole card, you will recognize what I'm going to start calling the double pane shaker method. And if you didn't, I'll link it in the description box below. But the basic idea is that I am going to use some lighter weight shaker elements. And I have found through trial and error that using an acetate sheet on both the back and the front of your shaker panel is a great way to ensure that you are going to get a lot more free movement with those lighter weight elements. So you just saw me attach an acetate window to the arch that will show in the front and also a matching arch that will not show in the back. Then I stack up both of the arches I cut from dollar store foam board, and that creates the well where all of my shaker bits are going to live. Speaking of shaker bits, I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at the Scrappy Boy Confetti shaker plates, but they are amazing. For this mix, I combined 3 of the different shaker plates: the spirals, the flowers and butterflies, and the hearts and rhinestones. Not only are the designs really versatile, but I find that cover plates can sometimes be a little challenging to cut, and these actually have cut very, very well for me every single time I've ever used them. Now, I will admit I did choose to use a single-sided specialty metallic paper when I cut some of these. So before I closed up my shaker window, I did have to go in and turn a few of them over because they were going to be white and not the metallic color that I wanted when I closed my shaker window. But you could easily avoid that by just using double-sided cardstock. Once I had everything laid out how I wanted it, then I closed my shaker window by adhering my back panel of acetate that has the black arch around it. Now, I did let this dry a little while off camera, but as you can see, having 2 pieces of acetate encapsulating all of your shaker bits really allows everything to move much more freely. And even better, it's so easy to line these 2 pieces up because they had already fit together perfectly. Now that you have your shaker panel adhered to your base layers, it's time to put on the smaller details. Now, converting this design to a shaker is fairly easy, as you can see. The only drawback to doing so is that we don't end up using the one die that has a placement guide. But not to worry, when something like that happens, I simply use the die itself as a reference point as I'm putting together the rest of the design. It also helps to start with some of the larger pieces that have a more well-defined area where they fit. This crossbar is a great place for us to start on this particular card, and I want to make sure that the piece doesn't sag in the middle, so I'm placing an extra layer of cardstock beneath that piece, ensuring that the area that it will be adhered to is completely flat. It also helps to audition some of your larger pieces before you commit to the adhesive. Now, you know I am normally a dedicated liquid glue user, but in a case in which we are using a lot of adhesive on top of acetate, it really is a good idea to at least use a combination of wet and dry glues. Acetate is a non-porous surface, so liquid glues need to dry completely before they provide that strong hold, unlike dry adhesives, which will bond very quickly but might not last the test of time when it comes to how strong their hold continues to be. Since I'm making a card, I ultimately don't really care how long into the future this adhesive will hold. But if you're including this in a scrapbooking layout or making it into a mini book, it is something to consider. I did want to point out here as I put together the speaker that the yellow layer I'm using to back the mesh was actually the middle of the frame die. I did mention briefly at the beginning that I cut that piece twice. I was unsure if it was obvious why I cut that piece twice, so I wanted to mention it here. I also wanted to mention how much I love that a lot of these pieces have a layering element or some kind of matting. Details like that really make a difference in more complex designs, and I really appreciate the cleanliness of the finished product when a designer chooses to use layers in this way. Next, I'm going to layer up and adhere the upper and lower trim pieces. Each of these have a base layer and a top layer, and when they're all laid out next to each other, you can definitely see the top pair are slightly smaller than the bottom pair. It might seem a little strange that I chose to do the bottom pair a different color than the top pair, but when I was looking at the source images I found online, pretty much all of them had red and chrome trim at the top, but then the bottom pair usually matched the color of the body. I also thought that for the purposes of the tutorial, it would just be easier to see them if they were a different color for the top pair than they are for the bottom pair. But at the end of the day, going by the source image was essentially just so that I could show the classic way that these looked in real life. You know I always do an extra project, so I will show you at the end of the video exactly how you could take this in any direction that you wanted to. Once we finish those up, it is time to add the venting. In the original design, this venting at the bottom of the main piece actually appears as a cut out. So you would normally cut this and then you would discard those little strips that I have attached to the low-tack tape. Instead, we're going to keep those strips and eventually discard this larger piece that I'm using as a guide. Using a pretty conservative amount of liquid glue, I'm piecing each of these strips back into place. Once all the strips are adhered, I'll remove that guide and our venting will be in place. I wouldn't call the venting an optional piece, but if you didn't want to go through this process, you could leave them off. I'm not sure that it would affect the look of the jukebox that much. You'll have two little frames that fit right into the half circle at the top of the jukebox. These are just to add interest to that part of the design, and I do see them as somewhat optional. On an actual vintage Wurlitzer jukebox, you would be able to see the records stacked up inside of the machine through this window. Next, we're going to place the panel that goes over the top of the speaker. This piece has a main layer, a decorative layer, and a solid back piece. We'll place the top trim where it's designed to go at the top of the arch. You can see here how well it fits inside the outline of the base layer. The last thing that we'll add is this top control panel. This is an important part to complete the look. It's the panel where the tracks would be listed and all the buttons and controls for the machine would be placed. Similar to the piece above the speaker, it has a base layer, a main layer, and an accent piece. Once our control panel is adhered, we are done. This jukebox came out this past month with our summer Fling collection. The movie that inspired this collection is absolutely one of my favorite movies of all time, and I remember as a child being very, very obsessed with all the dancing. The images in this set are inspired by some of the most iconic moments of the film, and the sentiments that accompany them are perfect. Everything from I hope you have the time of your life to God wouldn't have given you maracas if he didn't want you to shake them. Once I added my image and sentiment, I looked through some of the remaining shaker elements that I didn't use in the body of the card for accent pieces. I love the size and versatility of all of the pieces that you can cut with our shaker panels. I love to use them as little accent pieces to finish off my scene. I really feel like these little touches give your finished card a personality and a flow that they might not if you didn't add them. And with that, our card is finished. Now, you know I always make a secondary project, and you know how much I love Halloween. I couldn't resist pulling out my Halloween pinups and making a Monster Mash jukebox. As you can see, non-traditional colors absolutely work perfectly fine. And this is the classic version, not the shaker version. So it does include that additional base layer that we discarded for the shaker version. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me. We love you in our little craft community, and we could not do this without you. Speaking of community, I hope you are following us and joining us on Facebook and Instagram. There you will find inspiration, shipping updates, news, new releases, and some amazing projects by our awesome design team. All the stamps and dies I used in today's projects can be found on scrappyboy.com, and all of the links to follow us on Instagram, join our Facebook group, and visit the store are in the description box below. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and a comment telling me what you liked about it, and make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel so you don't miss any future uploads. And as always, if you remember nothing else, then remember this: nobody puts baby in a corner, and when in doubt, carry the watermelon. See you next time. Bye.